Again, I'm Erin Valdez. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this wonderful conversation that we're going to have this afternoon. Thank you for being here. Texas Public Policy Foundation's Right on Work initiative focuses on 4 primary principles. We believe that work develops and instills a sense of dignity in oneself. We know that traditional college is not the only successful pathway to learning marketable skills and becoming gainfully employed. We believe that public, private, and educational institutions should coordinate to offer market-driven opportunities. And we believe that skill-based education should be affordable for students, and any publicly funded programs must be transparent and accountable to taxpayers. So among those things, they're very lofty principles that we have, but this program really illustrates what it looks like on the ground. And so we're very pleased to welcome our guest, Darren Babcock. Darren Babcock left a successful corporate career along with his comfortable home in Frisco, Texas, to serve the inner city residents of Bonton. Although Bonton is historically known for its high crime, poverty, and violence, he believes another world is possible. Darren's broad professional experience, coupled with his heart for serving inner city communities, brings a fresh and innovative perspective to solving problems there. He founded Bonton Farms in 2014, where he currently serves as executive director. Daron and his wife Theda live in Bonton. And to have our conversation, we're very, very pleased to have Ron Simmons. The Honorable Ron Simmons is the Director of Right on Work at TPPF. He previously served as the state representative for House District 65 in Denton County from 2013 to 2019. He was the chair of the Policy Committee for the Texas House of Representatives Republican Caucus and the subcommittee chairman of the Long-Term Financing and Planning Transportation Committee. In the 85th legislative session, Representative Simmons was appointed to the House Committees on Transportation, Appropriations, and the Local and Consent Calendars. He also served on the Texas Conservative Coalition Research Institute Board of Directors. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Ron Simmons and Darren Babcock.
Thank you. Welcome, Darren. Glad to have you, man.
Glad to be here.
It's going to be a good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. We keep it cold in here so there's no nodding, okay? And if you're nodding, we're going to just crank her down further, okay? We got further we can go. But we know it's been a lot of you have traveled in today, so we know it's been kind of a long day. And it was a great sessions this afternoon, great lunch session. But we want to end it on a high note. And one of the more rewarding stories that I've ever heard and experienced has been Bonton Farms. And meeting Daron, and I go to church up at Prestonwood in Dallas, or Preston World as some people call it because it's so large. And I've always heard about Bonton because our church helps down there sometimes. I thought, well, what is Bonton? So had the opportunity to go down there with Kevin Roberts and Steve Rowe and some others to visit Darren and see what they're doing. And it was just literally remarkable. At the end of our session today, we're going to finish up by talking about what policy changes need to be made to help communities like what Darren's doing thrive, because that's what Texas Public Policy Foundation is all about. Look for where areas where policies need to be eliminated, changed, or added, and make sure that we push to get that done. So Darren, welcome. Why don't you give us a history of Bonton? I'm not talking about how it is today, but like you've told me kind of where it came from a long time ago.
Well, Bonton is a freedmen's community. It was established after Emancipation Proclamation by freed slaves. If you're not familiar with Dallas, along the Trinity River in the southern sector, there's several freedmen's communities that were established there along the banks of the Trinity River because at the time it was a place that they could build and nobody would harass them. And so we're on the bank of the Trinity River. There's another old historic freedmen's community on the other side of the river called Joppy. And as Dallas City Center started forming, people from our community and Joppy and others started trying to build encampments a little closer to downtown to take advantage of the work opportunities that were there. And that was not received well at the time. So those encampments were bombed, and they referred to our community as Bombtown. A little bit later, The music scene was kicking off in Dallas. Ray Charles got his start there.
Yeah.
And a dirt road was built connecting Bombtown to the place where the music was going. And people started coming to our neighborhood for the after party because it was like the Wild West. And so they changed the name from Bombtown to Bonton for good times. And because of the bombings, the mayor at the time was a mayor named Savage that decided that he
No
was...
pun intended,
no pun,
right?
No
Okay.
pun intended. But his plan was to try to stop the violence, was to keep the black families that were trying to establish themselves in that part of town where they belong. So he was going to build public housing. So I applied for 2 public housing grants to do just that, and Bonton was awarded 2 public housing. So in the floodplain along the Trinity River, we had about 3,500 people that moved into our neighborhood in public housing with an intent to try to keep them there. I think we know now, we're far enough along from that, that that's a bad social experiment when you congregate a bunch of economically challenged people in one place. It perpetuates those problems, and Bonton became a very violent gang. You had to be a part of a gang to survive. In fact, when I moved to Bonton, they had changed the name of it because in the prison system, if you have Bonton or 007, the gang there tattooed on your arm, it actually means something. It carries weight in the prison system. And so to try to get away from the negative connotation of the name, they changed our name to Rochester Park. And you know what changed? Nothing. I tell everybody I was a really bad kid growing up, and if my parents thought they could call me Frank, I would be Frank here today, but they knew that wasn't any good. So we lobbied to get our name changed back, and I think if you go search Bonton in Dallas today, you won't see much of anything but good news. Our community is really transforming, but it comes from a very dark and difficult past.
Yeah, and I thought one of the things that I thought was unique about Bonton, which makes it helps, I think it helped, it isolated it at one time, but now it helps make it work. It is actually geographically divided from the rest of the city in a sense, and explain that a little bit.
Well, like I said, we're up against the Trinity River. A little bit later as Dallas formed, there was a highway and a railroad put in, so we're literally isolated by a highway, a railroad, and a river. On the 2 ways in and 2 ways out of our neighborhood, you have to go under the highway or under the railroad track. And on both of those, they put floodgates in. So when our neighborhood would flood, they'd shut those floodgates to keep the waters in our neighborhood.
Yeah.
Those gates are still there. When I started coming to Bonton, people like me, outsiders, couldn't go there unless somebody brought you in. So I would have to call my friends, and they'd have to meet me at the floodgates to escort me in, or you'd get what they call hood evicted. And you don't want to be hood evicted.
No, it doesn't sound like good to me. So the interesting thing about it is it's very easy to identify. Like, it's hard to do that in some major cities, but Bonton's very easy to identify, and it's easier to build a sense of community when you're able to do that. So tell us about, we touched on a little bit in the film, but tell us more about Daron, and how does Daron end up from Frisco, Texas, and all other places down into Bonton, and your family story with that?
It's just a God story, to be honest with you. I don't know how to explain it. I grew up in Amarillo, Texas, to an amazing family, but in Amarillo, I was raised kind of an old traditional way that men were raised. It was all about work ethic and character and integrity, and the work ethic thing was really emphasized. And I got a scholarship to wrestle at the University of Oklahoma, and I'll never forget the first time we showed up at the school. They handed out our gear, and on the back of our T-shirts it said Oklahoma Wrestling. On the back of it, it said, "If it is to be, it's up to me." And it's kind of that reinforcement of whatever you work for, you can have. And I met a beautiful young lady that I convinced I was a better man than I was at the time. And when we graduated...
We've all been guilty of that, my friend.
When we graduated, got married, had 2 sons, I wanted to own my own business, and I wanted to live in the Pacific Northwest, and so we did that. Everything that I had worked for, I had gotten. And then shortly after we got there, my wife was diagnosed with cancer. And, it's the first time in my life that I faced something that I was aware of that I was really powerless over. It was the one thing I would have given anything to do. I would have worked and done anything, and nothing I could do. 2 years to the date after that, she passed away. And I just went through a crisis, faith crisis, a crisis of every regard. And in that time, my family, when I had lost hope, my family and friends didn't quit on me. And, because of them, I got through it. And then years later, as my life got back on track and I went back to work, I worked for a private equity firm, lived in Dallas. One day, a friend of mine invited me down to this inner city community called Bonton to meet with a group of men from that neighborhood that were returning home from prison and trying not to go back. And those men changed my life. I tell people sometimes you see things you can't unsee. And for me, those men opened my eyes up to something. They had been through more in their life, probably from birth, than I had been when I had the tragedy that almost sunk me, but they were still standing, And the thing that was different between me and them is that they didn't have the people that surrounding them that lifted them up out of it. And so I just felt compelled that to give back what had been so freely given to me is to walk with these guys through that journey and to be there for them. But
you had no idea what that was going to look like at the time.
I had no idea. I tell you, I was totally ignorant to the things that we're going to talk about today. So much so that I thought, I have to move here. Like, there's no way I can learn or be a mentor or can even understand if I'm not present. And so 8 years ago this month, I moved to Bonton, and the rest of the story I think you'll hear in a minute.
Well, that's really pretty incredible, Darren. It's just a tribute to what people are willing to do. And of course, there are other stories like yours out there. And when something moves on your heart that you want to make a difference, great things can happen. And that's really one of the great stories of America, right? Is that we're always looking to give people a hand up. And we know that a hand up always works much better than a handout. Now, sometimes we may have to have handouts to help people survive, but it has to be in the process of a hand up. And let's talk a little bit about if you describe, let's say 8 years ago, when you got there, describe the Banton community, and then we're going to move it forward.
I think you probably saw some of it in that video, even though that video was just shot 6 months ago. They intentionally kind of shot video of the older stuff to give context of where we were working. But Bonton was a place where both housing projects had been torn down, so our community was culled from about 5,000 people down to 1,200 overnight. All the services or any other kind of nonprofits that were there left the community. 4,000 people were displaced from the neighborhood and put into wherever other public housing was. And
it's primarily African American
still
community.
To this day.
Okay.
Yeah. And I couldn't get internet service. They wouldn't come out and put
And
internet.
we're talking about less than 3 miles from downtown Dallas.
If you had emergency services, you had to carry people out to the railroad tracks to get there.
To the floodgates.
To the railroad tracks, which are a little kind of not quite to the floodgates, but they wouldn't come in the neighborhood. It's just a really dangerous place to be.
When you got there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so what about the young men and women that were coming out of there? What was happening to them? Where were they going?
Well, half our men will go to prison for their 25th birthday. It's been that way for 40 years.
So half of the young men in a neighborhood like that end up in prison before their 25th birthday. And think about what that does to them, even if they do want to, change their life around.
Yeah, it's, this is a hard thing for me to do because these statistics for me are my friends. They're my neighbors.
Sure.
They're people that I see great potential in, but that we've kind of constructed a system that doesn't really empower them to reach their potential. But the good news is I think that we have answers that can change that. It's just going to take a commitment and an opportunity like this to mobilize people to say we can do better.
And then we talked about crime a little bit earlier, but talk about crime. What's changed? Okay, when you started, Daron, and you looked around. I mean, Bonton is literally in a food desert. You understand what I mean by food desert? There's no grocery stores around. They'll even come down there. One of the reasons you guys put the farm in. But when you looked around and you started that, was what was in your mind? I said y'all tried a lot of things and failed at them. What was in your mind, something that has stuck with you all along that you saw pretty early on that these people need? Was there something that just stuck out?
Yeah, I had no idea. You know, when I moved in, I literally, first of all, if you remember, 8 years ago would have been 2011, January 2011 is when I moved in, so I started trying to sell my house in 2010. What was the housing market like in 2010?
Not as good as it is today.
So part of this was my negotiation with God that, you know, hey, my house won't sell anyway. But it sold right when I put it on the market to somebody relocating through a company relo. And so I had to find a place to live, and the only place that I could live was a Habitat house that had been defaulted on. The neighborhood had come in and ripped all the copper out of the house, and it had been turned into what they call a trap house, a drug and prostitution house. And so I moved into this home, and for the first 6 months I was there, we still had customers daily coming by. So you should see that when I answer the door.
That didn't.
So everybody, when I had the chance to meet them, thought that I was with some branch of law enforcement. So there was this conversation, and most of that conversation was more of an interrogation, trying to figure out who I was and what my business was there. But at the end of those conversations, I would always see, look, I don't, you know, I'm not here to do anything. I just want to be a good neighbor and to learn. But if there were something I could do, what would it be? And for those first 6 months where all those meetings were taking place, every single person I met said jobs.
That was their number
And
one
I didn't
thing.
understand that, but I would always say, well, I worked for a company that owned 120 companies. So if I could introduce you to somebody that could hire you, what do you have to offer? What's your value? What would you tell them? Why should they hire you? And I would get these blank stares back, like I'd started speaking Mandarin or something.
Mm-hmm.
And so the one thing I knew is if you don't know your value, nobody's going to figure it out for you. So we started working in our neighborhood to pick up trash and mow yards and repair fences and roofs, anything we could do to help our neighborhood start on the right track and use that work to build resumes from. And so when I moved there, the one thing I knew is the one thing they told me, is that jobs. Almost immediately, people didn't show up to work. They were calling in sick. And I'm like, you can't do that. You know, if you want to work, you have to be there when the schedule says. But they weren't calling in sick the way I was used to. My friend Darrens, the reason our relationship is the reason this started, but he's like, man, I love what's happening here. You know, he was one of the most feared guys in a really scary neighborhood. And his life started to change as our relationship built. But Darrens is dying. You know, he has diabetes-induced kidney failure and congestive heart failure related to that. And so he's like, I just won't ever be able to participate on Monday, Wednesday, or Friday. I'm like, well, then I guess you really don't want to work. And he's like, no, I have dialysis those days. I can't go. And we had this over and over and over again. I had a guy named Willie that still works for us to this day who, when we were picking out trash, we would be scattered over a 2 or 3 block area. And I would always say, hey, when you're done, fellas, put the trash on this corner and meet us over here. And Willie'd always do it backwards. Now, we didn't have a nonprofit. We weren't paying people to do this at this time. This was just grassroots thing, trying to see what we could do. And so I was sensitive to the fact I was having people work for free, and I was giving them direction. And so I called Willie to the side one day. I said, Willie, I don't understand. You're a really smart guy, but you're always doing things backwards. And if you get a job, they're going to pay you to do what they want you to do, and you're going to have to follow those orders. So I'm just trying to prepare you for that. And Willie looked down and he said, you're always pointing. I'm like, I don't understand what you're saying. He said, if you would just tell me I could do it, but you're always pointing, I can't see. And I was like, why wouldn't you tell me that? And he's like, because I was afraid you wouldn't let me participate. And I think that's a really important story to tell, because I think there's a huge misperception that people that are born into places like Banton don't want to work, and it's just not true. They want to work so bad, they'll lie and they'll hide disadvantages they have so that they might have that opportunity when it comes their way. And so Willie's story is still something that drives me to this day. It's an important part to tell. So we learned that jobs, economic development, and health and wellness, because if you're not well,
And part of that's from the food desert, right?
Yeah, it's simply 2 things. If you talk to people who know, it's the stress of poverty, and it's because they don't have access to food. So the food we have are what they sell in the liquor stores, and if that's all you eat for long enough, it makes you sick. So I think you heard in the video, in our neighborhood, Bonton is in the middle of Dallas County, so we're literally like the donut hole. And in that donut hole, we suffer from more than double the rate of cancer and stroke and heart disease and diabetes and childhood obesity than the county we're in. And it's for those two reasons.
Wow. Let's talk just a little bit about, so 50% of the young men are ended up in prison, and a lot of those come out of single-family homes. We'll get into that in a minute. But I want to talk about, and this is kind of a little bit of a policy area, so I'm going to kind of alert you to that. Talk about what happens when these young men come out of prison. The ones that, I mean, obviously some of them might not want to do better, but some of them actually do want to do better.
I have not met a person yet that didn't want to do better.
Okay.
You know, in the 8 years we've done this, we haven't had a single person go back.
Did you hear what that is? You know what the average recidivism rate is? It's unbelievable. And you haven't had one person go back that's come back into that community. Absolutely. So let's talk about what that means and what challenges they have.
Well, so let me just give you, I'll speak in generalities, but on average, the average person that comes into our program is 38 years old. We now serve men and women that are coming out of incarceration, homelessness, domestic abuse, human trafficking. It doesn't matter what you're coming out of. You're no longer locked up or beaten or high anymore, but you're also no more prepared to go out and flourish than if you were. So we're kind of that middleman that helps build the bridge between what you came out of and where you're going. But for those that have served time and being incarcerated, on average, they're 38 years old and on average did 10 years in prison. You know what doesn't last 10 years? Your ID or driver's license. So that means you're returning home without any form of identification. You know what? You need to get a job, an ID or driver's license. On average, those people...
Let me stop you right there. So one thing to think about, just as a policy deal, is that when these young men and women leave prison, why doesn't the state provide, assuming that they are eligible for an ID, at least provide them with a personal ID on their way out of prison? I mean, that would be a pretty simple thing to do. So something that we can think about from a policy standpoint. But go ahead, don't have an ID.
So on average, those folks, when they come home, have 12 violations. You see, when you go to prison, you go to a state or federal prison, but you get arrested in a place, in a city and county. And when they come home, they had legal issues before they went to prison. So far, 100%. On average, they've had 12 violations. Traffic tickets, parking tickets, headlights were out, didn't use a blinker, whatever those are, well, those don't go away while you're in prison. So now, those have converted over 10 years into warrants for their arrest. So you did 10 years in prison and you come home with no ID or driver's license and you have 12 warrants for your arrest. That now is about $7,000 in fines. So where do you need to go to try to remedy that? Where do you go to get your ID or driver's license? DMV.
Yeah.
What happens if you show up to the DMV with warrants for your arrest?
Probably going to go the popo.
So I can't. So how am I supposed to work? And this is where we talk about the work is hard, but there are barriers that are in the way that don't have to be. And so far, I've had conversations with people of every leaning in the political spectrum, and nobody has ever said that it serves anybody's best interest for people to come home without hope and not able to become productive.
So the question is, how do we get these men and women home with a truly fresh start, and is the right policy, and I'm not saying it is or it isn't, but it's worth discussing, is the right policy that you've served your time, that either those fines, are abated based on your time served, or there's a way that they can be paid off over time and it doesn't stop you from getting your driver's license or ID and a job, because it just creates a cycle. And except for people like Daron, the people that work with him, those people that go back up into the criminal world, because you don't have to have a license and all that there. So that's where they end up. And so it's a cycle, which was, when he told us that, it was just like, man, that's something that seems like we ought to be able to fix at a policy level.
Yeah, I think it is. We have a bill that's been presented now, and so we'll keep trying to press that through and see if we can't get some attention and get it moved forward.
And I know we're looking at that as an organization as well. Let's talk a little bit about, you and I've talked about this, a little bit about, you touched on it earlier, but I want more detail. Talk about public housing. And it's more of a federal thing, but what are, we can talk about what the problems are. I do want to do that, but let's talk about what would be a good solution for the housing scenario, if you have any thoughts on that.
So again, this stuff is, there's two sides of this. One is we're in 2020 in the richest country in the history of the world, in Dallas, one of the richest cities in the history of the world. And we have really, if this were a business, the businessmen in this room, it would have already been solved because it's logical. And if there was money at stake, we would do it. But here's the deal, here's the economics of it. If I'm in poverty and I've got some black marks on my record, whether it's incarceration or I've prostituted myself or whatever these things are, and I can get public housing, they pay for that. The economics of that is that they're no longer going to work because we're creating an entitlement where they get stuck in a system where I now feel secure, and I'm not going to let go of that for anything. When we help people get a job, right now, the economy's amazing, so our average starting job, nobody's hiring anybody for under $12 an hour, so we're having a good, decent starting wage, but average rent in our zip code on the south side of town is $12.40 a month. So the economics don't work. So is it better to go try to get a job at $12 an hour and not be able to afford a roof over my head, or to take the government entitlement of taking a roof over my head and not working? Right now, it's better to take the government entitlement. And what that does is it paralyzes not only that person, but the kids that are brought up into that, because it creates this cycle of, and it just self-perpetuates. And we have to work on that economy to make it more economical.
The idea would be, and it's something that we worked on at TPPF with Representative Frank and some others, and that is when they've done the right thing of getting that job, whether it's $12 an hour or whatever it is, you can't have these government assistance cliffs where it disincentivizes them to get off of it. There has to be a runway that we can provide that allows for them to stay on the assistance and gradually move off of that as their independence grows. And that's what we're trying to get done at TPPF. And we're working with the federal government on that, because one of the things that the federal government doesn't want to do, and I get it, I've been in touch with Sonny Perdue's group at the agriculture, is that they don't want people to stay on SNAP or food stamps if they don't need them when they're working, okay? And I get that, because they don't want abuse, I get that. But you also have to step back and practically say, okay, I get that, but the people that are trying to get independent, let's give them a runway to really help them, because, you know, in Texas, we have more jobs available than we have people looking for them, but we also have able-bodied people on government assistance. The vast majority of those people don't want to be on government assistance. They would love to be independent like you all are. But because of their lack of education or skills or whatever it happens to be, there's this gap. And one of the things that we're so excited about working with Daron and other people on is, how do we develop policies to incentivize the closure of that gap?
I mean, I think what we're talking about of removing barriers, when people come out of those difficult situations, removing the barriers that exist that are policy-driven. Housing is a really bad policy that incents the kind of behavior that we're seeing. It incents the people that feel insecure to continue on government assistance because it gives me a sense of security, and the alternative is insecure. And what we've learned is that when we create a pathway that gives the person a dignified right next step, not too much too fast, but a dignified right next step. And if that pathway sees them all the way through, not halfway through, because we do that We set people up, we take them halfway on this journey, and then they get there and and it stops.
We take them to the point where we still feel good about it.
A lot of people stop
Yeah.
when they get a job.
Yeah,
So
because
that's not
yeah.
what good looks like. That's a milestone,
Yeah.
but it's not the end.
Yeah,
And
because
that
you've
needs to
told me
change.
about so many times where people lose their job because they don't have transportation, they couldn't catch the bus, or their bus route takes them an hour and a half to get to a job, right?
Yeah.
Those types of things. One last thing before we take questions, we're going to take questions here in just a minute, is we talked a little bit beforehand about a new thing that y'all started education-wise. And I want you to talk about the school and then talk about how you determine who is allowed to be in that school, because there's a limit. It's a private school. So why don't you talk about that a little bit? It's really pretty interesting.
Well, I think you heard in the video that I mentioned that we believe that our community can normalize. So all those statistics we talked about are perverted. That's not normal. But we think our community can normalize in the next 20 years when we build the structures of healthy living that people have: job, economic opportunity, education, health and wellness, transportation, housing. When those things are in place, we think our community will normalize. And so one of those things is we have to intervene with our children. We have people that have been through severe trauma that are extremely challenged socioeconomically. And so what we've seen is that we're able to help the parents, a mother or grandmother, whoever. 95% of our families are single-parent households. So we're not talking about parents. We're talking about a parent or a grandparent in most cases. And if they have somebody at home fighting for them, we're able to have a significant impact on that family. But those kids need extra attention and help than what the public schools can give. So this year, last August, we started a private Christian school. And we scholarship in the kids that are the poorest, that have the most severe socioeconomic challenge, but they have somebody at home fighting for them. And then between the work that we do at
What you
Banton-
found, if they don't have at least one person fighting for them at home, even though you might give them that scholarship, it won't do any good, which
going
is
home.
very sad. But you also want to help the people that have a chance to be successful.
So you have to pick your battles and start. I mean, we need to go deeper and figure out for the kids that don't have somebody at home fighting for them, that are extremely poor. But we need to prove what we can prove now and show that we can make that kind of impact where we can. And that's what we're trying to do.